Welcome back, Joel. You are officially the first two-time non-James guest. My
Yes.
co-host has you beat, but other than that,
Hey.
there's a first time for everything. So thanks for coming back. Today, I wanted to talk to you about a video that you just put out, which is about another video that the Diary of the
Yep.
CEO created. It was sort of a debate between an atheist and a Christian apologist and a psychologist who is also I think, practicing Hindu. So it's complicated. The host was agnostic and sort of very
Mm-hmm.
inquisitive. I thought it was generally well done. But I just wanted to hear your perspective on that, like what prompted you to make the video and maybe where people can find that.
Yeah. So it's on my YouTube channel, The Natural Theologian. And, thanks for having me again on as a returning guest. It's great, Ian. It's great to see the kind of convergence of our interests and our project. So I was inspired, I guess I've been inspired to get back into the kind of atheist-theist debates to some extent on YouTube, and like the reaction video format seems like a great way to do that. But of course, what's interesting is that these have become no longer two-way debates, theist versus atheist. They've become three-way. Whether that's always the case in every podcast, it was in this one, which reminded me of a few years back, Rebecca Goldstein, the atheist, William Lane Craig, the Christian, and Jordan Peterson, three-way debate, which I can say more about. But yeah, the debate or discussion, I mean, it was framed more as a discussion because it's not just two-way, it's four participants, and they were going to cover multiple topics. I focused in my reaction on the initial part of the video where they were talking about the meaning of life. And their discussion is basically framed by the statistics we've kind of gotten used to hearing about how, especially in the last decade, there's a lot of decline in mental health. I heard the psychologist Dr. K on the podcast say recently elsewhere that health in all areas is radically improving in Western societies, like people's hearts and bodies, or basically what medicine can do, but not so in mental health. Like mental health is just declining as technology is increasing and so on. So those stats, plus that very recently there's a pretty noticeable increase in religiosity. The stats that Stephen Bartlett, host of Diary of a CEO, said for like the UK were like really radical. Like, I think he said pretty recently belief in God was down to like 18% or something, which is kind of nuts. Maybe that was for young people, but that in the last couple of years it had shot up to 36%. That's like doubling. And for those of us who have been following kind of the podcast, public intellectual space, it's almost impossible not to see this as like the fruition of an intellectual conversation. Now, I don't know how directly public intellectual conversation immediately feeds into psychological results. I mean, with this, you're at least seeing a big lag time from Jordan Peterson hopping onto the scene and challenging the new atheists to
like 10 years. Right.
It's nearly 10 years that you are seeing actual increase in belief in God, increase in church attendance. But
I just wanted to say, sorry, you're making an important point. Like these things are real, is sort of the fruit of podcasts is the way that you put it. But I would say podcasts are talking about real things that are coming to fruition.
they are.
Because the sort of like culture war, the atheist theist debates, all of these things, they may seem sort of contained to a sort of corner of the internet. But like I've spent time in pastoral ministry. You have too in some capacity or around.
I mean, I'm around it. I talk to people and see how the vibe shifts,
Yeah. let's just say, like, as a Christian in Christian spaces. So you get to see people who are maybe more willing to have conversations about God than, I don't know, some random person on the street. And the reason I'm bringing it up is because, like, I think there's a way of looking at the internet and saying, oh yeah, that's just all, sort of made up bot traffic. It's the Russians trying to split us all apart or whatever it is. It's
Yeah.
but people are really having existential crises of faith, and that means atheists and theists alike. Like,
Hmm.
atheism is sort of crumbling, and people are affected by it. I would say evangelicalism is
Hmm.
crumbling, and people are affected by it. And so the religiosity is sort of, that's a real spiritual dimension of our climate, the world we live
Yeah.
in.
Well, and people go to the internet when real life in person conversations aren't available. So, like, or they just do it with intimate topics that are hard to bring up in person. So I totally agree. Like, IRL, I love in real life, but the internet is real life too. It's just filtered. You know, it can distort our view of real life, but it still is real life. I guess the other point is just that there's a question of how the causality occurs, of like the fact that a podcast conversation is going on in 2016 doesn't immediately mean that, the sea of faith is now coming back in, if you will. But, add to that the 2020 COVID thing and the rise, peak, and now decline of wokeness, and like these different forces. Something that was being prepared in that podcast space can all of a sudden hit the moment where now people take it seriously. So, yeah. Now, so that was what framed the conversation, basically those stats. And now you've got the atheist, you've got a Christian apologist, Greg Koukl, kind of one of these baby boomer, I'm going to say, Christian apologists, a certain generation of Christian apologists. You got the young atheist, Alex O'Connor, who represents kind of new atheism, but with a new level of nuance. And then Dr. K, psychologist, and they called him spiritual thinker, has a background in, I believe, Hindu meditation, spiritual practices, whatever his actual beliefs. He's Healthy Gamer on YouTube. Millions of followers, kind of bringing psychology to folks who need it. So it's just an interesting setup. But let's start with what the atheist and the theist bring to the conversation. When they're asked about the meaning of life, there's kind of a common tendency. Both of them jump to the metaphysical. That's the debate they want to have. And so I'm preparing like a Substack version of my video. So that might be out by the time this podcast is out. And I really think it comes down to like the difference in a preposition. The meaning of life versus meaning in life.
Mm.
And the atheist and the theist, they really want to talk about the meaning of life. There's also a definite article that might be important there. The meaning of life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But regardless, like, they both want to ask, like, well, sort of what's the metaphysical conditions for there being meaning to life? If everything is matter in motion and nothing more, we're just projecting meaning onto it at best. Psychology is great. I mean, Alex O'Connor sort of throws a bone that, like, yeah, I mean, it's great to feel like there's meaning in life, but that might be all it is. It might be just pragmatism. There's nothing really there, but it's nice to be, deluded, or religious people have the opiate of the masses, and, that's great. They'll be happier. But there's still an emphasis that if there's no God, there's probably no meaning. And the Christian's saying, unless you believe in God, you really can't have meaning. Sometimes there's caveats. in the conversation, Greg Kokel mentions, like, I mean, if God exists, and this is a point I think we would want to maybe drive home further, then even people who don't believe in him can be sort of living kind of in the groove of how they're created. And that can be great, even if they haven't found sort of the ultimate purpose of their existence.
He used the phrase "in some measure."
In some measure, which, again, depending on how you go with that, could, I think, go in a really helpful direction, or I think more an unhelpful direction. And the tenor of the conversation, I think, went more in the unhelpful direction, where you're kind of emphasizing, if you don't believe in God, you haven't really found what you're about, and the gradations of more purpose and less purpose are kind of immaterial, you know. And I think we can get into this more. So many more things to say about that. But then the psychologist comes in and says, I hard disagree with kind of this emphasis. And it was really striking. And he brings in the idea that for him, the meaning of life, or rather, I would say meaning in life, is a very practical issue. Somebody comes to him and says, I really don't have any meaning in life. I kind of feel like killing myself. Well, Dr. K wants to help them. He wants to help them with that very practical issue of whether they're going to, put a bit of rope around their neck. Like, that's very key. And what he says is that that's a sliding scale. People have different levels of purpose. They respond to surveys that are trying to measure their level of purpose. And do you have purpose? Do you have control in life? Do you have meaning? These things cluster together of like this one psychological variable of how meaningful and purposeful do you find your life. And his point that he makes later in the conversation, where I, kind of stop and cheer, is I just want people to move some percentage points along that scale. Meanwhile, the atheist and the theist are saying it's kind of all or nothing. It's either matter in motion, there's no meaning, or God exists and there is meaning. They're basically agreed on that. And that means that these gradations don't matter. And to me, I don't think Christianity has that implication. Like, I think that's core to almost a whole generation of Christian and atheist apologists. This kind of ignoring of psychology, or downplaying it, or downplaying the kind of gradations, the better and worse. But I don't think that has to be.
So the subjectivity of experience is downplayed by atheists and theists, particularly maybe of the past generation recently, and unfortunately, like Derrida and some of these other people, I think, put people's defenses up. People are thinking, if it isn't objectively true, then we just go into this space, this post-truth space that, how can we discern anything? Is anything knowable? You get into some pretty fearful spaces, I think, because people are uncomfortable with maybe the responsibility, because something that's subjective is it requires extreme response or something like that. I can't use my words to say what I'm saying. The responsibility and responsivity are the same in this sense. Like, you not only have a duty, but you also have the capacity to respond to your subjective experience. And so when someone's suffering from depression or meaninglessness, they have those same duty and capacity, and yet there's a lot of work set ahead of them to change from someone without any meaning in their life to someone who has a greater sense, 1% greater, like Dr. K says. And so, I think it really does come down to subjectivity, which is interesting to me because I've been sort of immersed lost in thought, really, uh, about the relational nature of the world and my life, and like I don't, I'm sure there's a deep philosophical rabbit hole to go down as far as that goes. But like my experience of the world is one that is relational, sort of naturally, because I am a person and there are other people. But beyond that, even like objects, my standing desk that I have my laptop on, these things are uh, relationally designed to fit my hands and to be able to communicate language, which is also something that is relational. So my point is the fact that uh, this question with either preposition would be extremely subjective, but one the meaning of life is somehow they're trying to remove the subjectivity from the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. So you see this at a couple points in the debate. The clearest is when Alex O'Connor says something like, I just care about truth.
Yeah, yeah.
And when he said that, I was like, oh man, that's like all my fellow seminary theology nerds and, a certain kind of philosophy nerd. We just care about truth. But in saying that, what we actually are saying is we only care about a certain abstract domain of truth. We really like theology and philosophy questions, but we don't really understand why someone would study psychology, for example. And, the effect of me learning about Jordan Peterson, for example, has not been that I've become a pragmatist about truth or adopted, relativism about the truth of religious doctrines. The main effect for me is that I started to take psychology seriously as an objective, scientific, real discipline. AKA, like, this stuff's really going on. The subjective, and then you add the relational. We too often we operate with an objective subjective divide that is it's kind of like we drew the line in the wrong spot. Like our mind is on the subjective side of that line. When I'm like, this thing's really here.
Yeah, it's
this
pretty
is the objective domain of reality.
Yeah.
Ask a neuroscientist. Like they're learning real stuff. If somebody accidentally gets a pipe stuck through a certain part of the brain, a certain thing stops working, and then OCD could be cured. Crazy things have happened, but that's psychology. But it's all real, and it's not just for subjectivists, postmodernists, and people like that. But what I observe is that if you take that side of things more seriously, you don't become a subjectivist again. Think about Jordan Peterson, or his philosophical forefathers are people like William James. Or I want to plug Alain de Botton as well. I've got his book here called The Meaning of Life. And he's kind of the atheist who thinks atheists need to take these questions more seriously and less dismissively. And in fact, I was really excited that like 2 days ago, a video popped up on YouTube of Alex O'Connor speaking with Alain de Botton. Everyone should check this out because it's kind of new atheism bumping up against Alain de Botton, who says the attitude of an atheist towards religion should be like, God doesn't exist. Let's move on. Let's figure out now all the amazing things that can be learned from religion that contemporary science and atheism ignore. We tend to ignore the psychological well-being of people. We tend to ignore the way in which rituals, whether they are objectively true or not in their content, benefit people and shape their minds and their lives and give them a sense of meaning and purpose. And I think the worry for people on the Christian side is that this leads to a kind of theological liberalism, or indifference about the truth claims, so on and so forth. But I think for the atheist, it ends up being, let's take the phenomenon of religion and psychology a lot more seriously, which Alain de Botton's The School of Life is all about. It's very helpful, very, very awesome. On the Christian side, I think what it can be is taking a lot more seriously changes in other people short of conversion. So if somebody is not a Christian, we tend to just call them unbeliever and think solution is get saved. Okay, well, there's a lot of differences among unbelievers. One is a high-powered Wall Street finance guy who shows up to work on time every day. One is a drug addict dropout who really could use some Joe Rogan podcasts. Like these are very different problems, and we tend to just lump them together, that what they really just need is conversion. Well, what about, and then we worry that, if I help the drug addict live a more righteous life prior to getting converted, that this is works righteousness, that this is, if I get them living better, then they're hit by a car before I tell them the gospel, that, this was totally worthless and unhelpful. And I just think that is a really unhelpful mentality. Because again, it makes us want to press metaphysical questions and conversion and neglect and think that it's just unimportant how people live and whether they have a worse experience of life or a greater experience of life and practice of virtue.
I want to bring up something from John Vervaeke. Are you familiar with any of John's stuff?
Yeah, broadly.
So I want to talk about the 4 Ps of knowing. It's something I've brought up before. And I'm going to do my best here. Okay, so there are 4 Ps. The first is propositional. This is your knowing of facts, a collection of propositions. Science works in this domain as a set of constraints for building good theories. It's an essential form of knowing, and you can think of it as knowing that something is. Procedural is the next form. This is your knowing of sensory motor patterns, aka procedures, sequences of actions for interacting with and manipulating the world, culminating in expertise, knowing how to ride a bike, swim, kiss somebody. Those are the examples he gives. Then you have perspectival. This is your situational awareness, your particular perspective, the dynamic landscape of your attention and salience or relevance. What is foregrounded, what is backgrounded, what you're paying attention to, what you're not paying attention to. This is knowing what it's like to be here right now watching our podcast, or playing a VR video game, or visiting a certain city. You have perspectival knowledge of those things in your life. Then the 4th kind is participatory. This is the collection of identities you assume and assign to others, the affordances that couple you to your environment at multiple levels, creating an agent-arena relationship. This is the role that you play in the world around you. The multiple levels are the physical. You have a physical participation in the world around you, a biological, and a cultural. And so these 4 Ps are organized in the way that I read them: propositional, procedural, perspectival, participatory. And he says that in our culture we tend to venerate the propositional, and so that is precisely what Alex O'Connor and Greg Kokel are doing in the DOAC video, and that's what leads it to be an impossible. Or it's an impassable sort of problem. They can't move one way or the other because they have separate propositions that oppose one another. So it's sort of fight to the death. And if neither one dies, then you just have to go your separate ways and think your different propositions. However, Vervaeke claims that if you're not accessing and educating the non-propositional, your chance for wisdom and virtue drops significantly. And I think that's extremely true because as you were laying out the Wall Street individual who maybe suffers from a certain set of sins, and then the drug addict on the street who suffers a different amalgamation there of sins. The propositional is relevant. It's not irrelevant to their lives as far as the meaning of life, to use that set of sort of arguments and propositions. But the participatory, their experience of themselves in the world, that's actually foundational. So Vervaeke likes to move from the bottom up. If you go participatory, perspectival, procedural, and then propositional, he says that if you think that all you are and all that you know and all that you can do is your propositional knowing, and that all I have to do to transform you is change your belief, which is the fundamental lie of ideology, then you're being cut off from all this machinery, participatory knowing, perspectival knowing, procedural knowing, which lead to a sense of belonging, a sense of presence, and a sense of power, or a capacity for power. He says the non-propositional is foundational to meaning making. And so that's where I thought that this connected here, is that those three things about belonging, having presence, and having power, those things are absolutely essential and very, very subjective. Like we each will have our own experience of those things, but it must work in that order, beginning with the participatory. And so that's why I think Alok, Dr. K, is so resonant in that conversation for you and I. We sense that if you are not recognizing your participation in this question of meaning, then it's sort of separate. It's very deistic, actually, like meaning of life over here, me over here, and either you can claim it or not claim, leave it unclaimed and say that it's just matter.
Yeah, I mean, the propositional thing. I mean, this is why it feels very radical Protestant, if you will. And you're right. It's a part of all ideology. Like the progressive left view is very frequently that if you do not share my beliefs, you are a terrible person. And if you share my beliefs, you are a great person. And it's like, oh man, you need a dose of Catholicism or something. It's just like you need a dose of how you behave and practice actually matters. The propositions you say do not immediately predict or demonstrate your character. And so this clearly has implications for how we want people to go about, getting closer towards Christ. Clear, evident example to my mind, again, this is not on the kind of drug addict end of the spectrum, is Louise Perry, author of Case Against the Sexual Revolution, probably in the last couple of years started attending church somewhat regularly, but without believing. She wanted to be kind of a Christian atheist or a Christian agnostic. And I don't want to make pronouncements, but it sounded like she said recently in a clip that she's become a Christian in terms of belief. Whether or not that's what she meant to communicate, like that has been happening to a lot of people. But it's not something that at least Protestants or evangelicals have tended to encourage. We've been very concerned about kind of being nominal and how we don't want that. But it's clearly been very effective to offer people just come and taste. Just come and give it a try. Start putting these things into practice. And this is where, in the last 10 years, even before we started to see these stats, I'm talking to people who were influenced by Jordan Peterson or Tom Holland or some of these people who emphasize the pragmatic utility of Christianity, whether it's true or not. And they start to consider, I think hedonism is bad. Mm-hmm. I think I should live a self-disciplined life.
That's literally me. We have an episode on this channel. You can go find my story. And I was just going to say, I've always said that Peterson convinced me that the Bible was truer than true. It was so true that it's true at every level of analysis that it doesn't even matter if it's true objectively, materialistically. And this, I wanted to bring this up earlier. Kokel is saying in the video that he literally believes, and this is fine. This is, lots of people are in the same place. He literally believes that Eve ate a fruit, and O'Connor rightly, materialistically, just rephrases it back to him. He says, so you think that children die of cancer? This is something that they were talking about. Children die of cancer because the first woman ate a piece of fruit. Like, so if your entire thing hinges on propositional materialism, like then what are we talking about? As a participant in life, I struggle to resonate with Kokel's claim there. But what I found through Peterson was that he justified in a way that it's not like a non-answer or avoiding the tricky nature of, we'll just never know. You and I will never know. I mean, until maybe the afterlife or something. But like here and now, we will never be able to say, Eve ate a fruit, it was this kind of chemical composition, and this is why it was the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and there were
here's
seeds
the date that it occurred.
Right, exactly. There's no video camera footage of that moment, so we'll never, or core samples or whatever, Apple core samples. Okay, and it's like the idea. Sorry, I interrupted you, but Peterson is one good example, in my opinion, of somebody that legitimizes Christ in a way that doesn't require sort of the touching of the nail prints, right? Like Thomas, that's the way that the boomers and whatever, boomers sort of derogatory. I just mean that's a way a generation attempted to legitimize Christ. Like he's real, the Shroud of Turin, like we've got him, we figured it out. But that's propositional and it's materialistic in the same way, or naturalistic is the word I thought of you, the natural theologian. But Kokel says naturalistic says it's just atoms and molecules and that's all there is, and I was like, dude, maybe, but you're doing the same thing. Like your whole shtick is that naturally it's real and true, and I can't figure out how to communicate that to people like Greg.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to be, it's sort of like, if you weren't a Christian, what would you think? And for a long time, those of us who were Christians were like, I mean, I would give up everything.
Yeah, I would just
every
die
single proposition
immediately.
of Scripture would just be worthless. And yes, I would go kill myself immediately, because what's the point of existing? And I think what
Which
Jordan
is a good
Peterson,
reason to stick with your beliefs, by the way. Like,
yeah, well, it keeps you hanging on really tightly.
Yeah.
Which, makes your relationship now to non-believers very anxious. It's very all or nothing. I must not risk any of their beliefs accidentally seeping in and infecting me with non-Christian worldviews. Whereas Peterson says to non-believers, even if it's not true, it's highly important and
Meaningful.
meaningful. Wisdom, like the propositional truth of atheism, if that it were is the truth, would be kind of pointless in relationship to knowing the pragmatic truth of religious documents. So that has a scary implication then for the kind of Christian message, which is meant to be mirroring Paul's statement that if Christ is not risen, then we are dead in our sins. But it's not the same. It radicalizes that. I mean, we could test how Peterson and Paul fit together, but it radicalizes it and says, if all these purportedly objective details of Christianity aren't true, then life is completely meaningless. That's not the same as dead in our sins. That's a much more particular thing, that if the doctrine of the atonement is that Christ's resurrection overcame the debt of sin, well then yeah, if he didn't rise, the debt of sin was apparently too great for Christ to bear. Objective, particular point of theology there. But Peterson, William James, Alain de Botton, Carl Jung, thinkers like that are saying, another one, Leon Kass, great commentaries on Genesis and Exodus that led him from atheism as a Jew towards belief. All these thinkers are saying, even if it's not literally true, it is highly meaningful. The point of the story of the fall that everyone resonates with is when you say, this is what happens. This is what happens. I mean, and Augustine is basically saying that when he talks about being tempted by the pear and going and stealing from his neighbor. He's presenting it as something that always happens in the human heart. Or even Paul, when Paul says, for any human being in any situation, if you give them a command, the psychological effect is that they want to break that command. And, scientists have now confirmed that through psychology, that yes, when you tell somebody don't do something, it incites a desire to do that thing. So moral condemnation is not the most effective way to get people not to do something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But yeah, to say that something is truer than true, or that even if I came to believe that materialism can explain the universe, the God hypothesis is unnecessary, I wouldn't jump to nihilistic atheism. I would move down the ladder one step to Jungian, the world is meaningful and imbued with the glory of as if God. Something like that.
Yeah. Which, I mean, even you just saying that now is putting off red flags for people. Like, there's no steps. There's one step that you're safe on, and any step below that is inadequate.
Slippery slope down to, yep.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Right. And I was just thinking, so the Bible Project, Tim Mackey, he has some really good analysis. It's not like he didn't come up with it. It's just where I've encountered it. But Hebrew literature, like literary analysis of the scriptures, shows that the first story is repeated. And the analogy he uses is like a jazz melody. So you play it, in the third or in the seventh, and then you play it minor, or you play it sharp, and these melodies are like they're rephrasing the melody that was played initially, and you get to see the story or the melody through all of these different perspectives. It's such a beautiful analogy, and it really lands for me because in this conversation, because what you're just saying is it happens. And so it's a participatory present moment sort of thing where it affords you, your role in the story. And you say, okay, yes, I start to see, I'm like Eve, and that's like the fruit, and this is like what God is telling me, and that's like Satan or the snake, not Satan, but whatever.
Yeah. Who knows?
Right. And so you have this ability to step in. That's actually something that's the reason that I brought up Vervaeke. Well, not the reason I brought him up. The reason I was looking into these forms of knowing is because I was thinking of the imaginal, and that's something that is it's key to Vervaeke's construct of how to think or how we do think and how to be in the world and a sort of good spiritual practice. But imaginal thinking is different than imaginary, because you can imaginary pink elephant, but that doesn't necessarily afford you the opportunity to step into something. So like when you are playing house as a kid, that's a good psychological study. But like if you're doing that, you're trying to figure out the role of, like you want to be a good dad or you want to be a good mom. And so this is sort of like how you learn to take other people's perspectives, but also form your own identity. And so with that, going back to the replaying of the stories, to give an example, Abraham is going to Egypt, and he is worried about his wife Sarah and whether or not the king of Egypt is going to like take her for his own. So in that story, it says the Pharaoh saw Sarah and that she was good to look at, or something like that. And that's the same phrase as the apple in the beginning, right? And so that's the key, like, okay, so we're going back to there. Okay, now I'm thinking of the Garden of Eden, the tree, and Eve and the snake and God and all of that. And then there's this dynamic character switching. That's not the right term, but there's a term for it, that all of a sudden Pharaoh becomes Eve in that story because he's seeing and wants to take. And then Eve becomes the fruit in that story. And then God stays the same in this example. And then there's only one character left. It's the snake. And Abram takes the snake role. And so it's like, whoa, dude, this is crazy. You just get to, you start thinking, oh my gosh, wow, am I like tempting other people? Because in that story, the Pharaoh comes back and he's like, why did you do that to me, Abraham? He blames Abraham for offering up his wife as his sister or whatever. It's a whole weird Bible story. But
that is so, yeah.
Yeah. And so
it feels like God coming to Adam.
Yes.
In the garden. So now they've flipped. Yeah.
Yes. And so anyway, what I'm trying to say is I resonate with your use of the word it's happening or it happens, because that is extremely relevant to today, rather than pinning everything on a propositional account of materialistic events. Not saying that these things didn't happen. I couldn't know one way or the other, which is why I would much rather build from a participatory level to the perspectival level. Like, okay, this is what's happening in my life. I see it from this point of view. Like I'm all of a sudden I'm the snake. And then you can go to the procedural, like, okay, so if I do this, I'm like the snake. But if I do this, I'm like God, or I get a chance to rewrite the story and be Eve and do what God said, or, like that gives you this sort of thing that Dr. K, the psychologist, is saying gives you meaning in life. It imbues your role with agency and just relevance, like you matter. And all of a sudden things are meaningful, what decisions I make, what I do, rather than this abstract, objective proposition that I must adhere to through some sort of like verbal assent, like, yes, I believe that. Then it gives a sense of purpose and meaning to the ways that I act out, participate in that proposition.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm thinking about the imitation of Christ here, and what I've come to is that we can invite people to imitate Christ before they believe in Christ. Because, and it's partly like there's solid doctrine behind this, like the natural law is supposed to be available to everybody, even the unbeliever. It's written on their heart. And to sacrifice the desires of the present for the long-term good is part of the natural law. The psychologists are coming upon it today in the marshmallow experiment, Like, these are psychological traits. It is good to exemplify. Your life will go better in sort of proverbial terms. The book of Proverbs there is full of this stuff. And whether people live in accord with that, it's also preparation for the gospel. Even just in the really Protestant version of give it a try, fail, then you need Jesus. But of course, that's too little, because believing in Jesus is then supposed to be lived out. And the only way we can tell whether you truly believe in Jesus is whether you live like Jesus lived, sacrificially, bearing your cross in practical terms. And so Peterson is inviting people to live as if that's true before they have decided if it really happened. But that's what we should have been doing all along. Like, what Jesus, if you're Protestant, like, we're so formed by a narrowing of Paul to the exclusion of Christ's teaching and Paul's fuller teaching. If you go back to the Gospels, Jesus he's pretty down on just saying and believing the right things. He's like, I want to see how you treat widows and orphans. I want to see how you act towards the least of these. I want to see whether you're just a Pharisee. And there are people who are living that out, at least partially, better than the people who say they believe in Christ. And so if we're attentive to that distinction, it's not that we dismiss the level of belief in theology as unimportant, but we kind of shift the emphasis. And I think it opens up this possibility, once again, of inviting people to act as if God exists, to live self-sacrificially before they've decided on belief. And I think the calling of the psychologist is really interesting. It's been very helpful to me in coming to some of this thinking that my wife is in Christian counseling. Because while the majority of her counselees are Christian, not all of them are. And you still start to think about, what do I practically want somebody to do? Do I want them, is the goal of their Christian counseling to get them to believe the right things? No, in many cases, they already believe it. And for the ones who don't, oftentimes the obstacle to belief is not in pointy-headed intellectual objections. It's how they're living. Or not just in the sense of, they're living in sin, but just like they haven't learned to clean their room. They haven't learned to kind of get their life together to the point where there's a certain level of self-discipline even to show up, say, to church on a Sunday. Well, some non-Christians have that level of discipline and some don't. And so, assuming for the moment that the goal is to get them to church on Sunday morning where they can hear the gospel, a prerequisite to that is having a certain level of conscientiousness and self-discipline that they can even make an obligation like that. The order is not believe first and then do. It is do, keep doing, and believe somewhere along the way and keep doing. And if you don't end up doing, that is good, cold, hard evidence that you don't believe. In the end, that's all the apostasy passages of Hebrew. That's all of Christ's teaching. If you don't do, you're not believing. And that is actual Reformed Protestant theology, that if you're not bearing the fruit of faith, it's dead faith. That's Calvinism.
Yeah, which is obviously interesting in light of the rejection of works in relation to salvation. So I was trying to work on. You used the prepositions, and I was having fun. I also I couldn't slip this in here, so I'll just say, when you said that, I was thinking typically the natural theologian works on presuppositional apologetics, but today he's working on prepositional apologetics. So it's like the meaning of life versus meaning in life. And I was trying to
Yeah.
figure out if there's a correlation or some similar phrase with salvation, because there's a sort of like the salvation of a life and salvation in a life, something like that, where uh, there's the Philippians verse that I think freaks people out because it says like work out your salvation in
Yeah.
fear and trembling. And I don't know if they think that's like a negotiation, some people, or you know what I mean? Like, okay, God,
Hmm.
are you really saving me? Like, let's work this out. But to me, it seems very clearly to be what you're talking about, that you would do these things because teach people uh, to that's what he says, right? In the Great
To
Commission. Am
obey.
I just yeah. So teach people to obey the things I'm teaching them is very different than teach people to believe that everything happened a certain way, and so
Hmm.
they either must obey or reject outright. And it's so interesting. Your example of Louise Perry is really compelling to me because she walks in the door, and as you say, that's a Christian practice. It's a form of doing. It isn't
Hmm.
taking care of the poor or the widow or the orphan. It isn't sort of an act of service necessarily, but it is a practice.
Her background was helping people who were, sexual abuse survivors and stuff like that. So, in a
Yes,
way, she was
she's
putting it
got
into
that
practice.
covered. Yeah. Uh, and so, and again, not covered in the sense of like checked off so she can turn her ticket into God and say, look, I did this stuff. But like that part of her life is being fulfilled. And I think many Christians take the same, like your wife, take the same sense of meaning and fulfillment and purpose in their practices with Christian counselees or non-Christian ones. Um,
Hmm.
okay, so what is compelling is that she comes around to this. We already basically said this, but she walks in denying the propositional, or ignoring the propositional, let's say. But
Hmm.
but from a participatory level, I don't know what church she was going to. Let's say there was a cathedral involved. She's experiencing very tactilely the presence of God in the form of beauty and of goodness and of truth. And then, and truth is funny here because people would say, well, she's ignoring the propositions, but the truths are still apparent and available to her regardless of the propositions. So she doesn't have to say, I believe in a 6-day creation, because that's irrelevant to the truth, right? Like, which is so difficult when you valorize the propositional as the only way of knowing something.
Yeah, I was thinking earlier of with salvation, is there some propositional or prepositional phrase we can introduce? I was thinking more verbal, getting saved versus being saved.
Yes,
There,
yeah.
there's Pauline language about you are still being saved. Like there's a lot of
Hmm.
Pauline language we're uncomfortable with. The stereotype is that the Reformed or the Protestant emphasis is all Paul, but it's not Paul. It's a certain percentage of Paul. Paul says we are being saved. He says we are filling up with what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ. He says a lot of stuff. But yeah, getting saved versus being saved. And this is where people think it sounds Catholic, because if the goal is being saved, the Catholics are fine with you just coming into the cathedral and starting to taste and see. And then after you get confirmed, they're like, you're not good yet. You got to keep doing it. And I think there's like a logical error we make as Protestants, which is that Protestantism undid that. Now we get assurance.
Mm-hmm.
We get 100% get out of jail free card. But the scriptures never promise that. They say the evidence of whether you believe is in how you live. They warn of the possibility of apostasy. And, they say work out your salvation with fear and trembling. They say that you're being saved. The word salvation, I was just learning, it has a root more in like healing. Like that was the phrase, the Greek word for a lot of healings that Christ did. So that sounds much more like an ongoing process. But back to the point is, if it's about being saved, well, someone can begin that process before, quote unquote, getting saved, and they have to continue the process after, quote unquote, getting saved. In fact, I think the only point at which you really, well, we could discuss more, but the clearest point of getting saved is, Paul says you will be saved. Okay, so our own resurrection and glorification. That's when the process of salvation has a real line in the sand. For a lot of us, we try to pinpoint, the point at which we got saved. And the more you reflect on it, the more you're like, some of that stuff was in process before. It was a big process afterward. Who knows which moment. But yeah, so I'm neglecting the second part of what you said. But if you want to jog my memory.
Yeah.
The propositional Louise Perry.
Yeah. I think that it's so interesting that she is able to walk into the setting of, my understanding of many Christians would be that they're listening to this thinking the propositional is extremely important, if not the most important aspect of belief in God. However, she walks in ignoring the propositional, and maybe you could say, with your interpretation of her recent words, that she has attained this propositional understanding, and that's what's really her, that really matters. But she goes into it, I think, at the participatory level, and she starts to maybe someone prays with her, maybe somebody just offers her to come over for a dinner, or she begins living participatorily in the body of Christ, and then it moves to the perspectival, which is internet. Okay, then she moves to the perspectival, and she begins to see things from her point of view. I want to refer to the slide here because I want to say that. So she's like, knowing what it is like to be a part of a Christian community and what it is like to live in that way. And then knowing how to is the next. It's procedural. And so then this is sort of, I think, relevant to your point about going through the steps of doing the thing, and then believing, and then doing the thing. You never stop doing it, because that's sort of what it's about. It is an extremely here and now, present thing that you're always going to be doing. And one thing on what you were just saying about getting saved versus being saved, I think there's an element of that that indicates something we haven't quite talked about today, which is God's agency in this process. And I think that's relevant to our homeless person and our Wall Street person. I think it's relevant to our own lives. And it's interesting because you just brought up Calvinism, the sheer dogmatism around the idea of God being the first actor, but it's also something my dad, who is not, it doesn't really align with Calvinists, let's say, on most theology, but he firmly states that is the way that it is. He can't believe it's any other way, and yet there is some relational components to this that I come from Calvary Chapels. They talk about God initiates and man responds. That's a common phrase there, and I think that's sort of what I was talking about earlier with responsibility. But anyway, the main thing is we start at the propositional, and if people fail to meet that criteria, then they failed altogether. But I think that the propositional is sort of the distillation of the primary, which is participation in life with God. And so I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, you've been talking about the overemphasis on the propositional, and I was just trying to sort of formulate the kind of core of my argument, which is, I think existing Christian argument is something like, without God, there can be no meaning. Atheism has no God, therefore atheists have no meaning. Or broadly, unbelievers lack meaning. But that's a fallacious argument because unbelievers and atheists do have God because God exists and they live in the world God made. Like their
Isn't
access
that
to God
presuppositionalism?
in a sense, it's sort of like if you don't presuppose, you don't get God. Or in this case, more broadly, if you don't believe, you have no relation to God. But that's not true. Like I'm thinking of Francis Schaeffer's book title, The God Who Is There, which when I saw that title, in a college library, I was like, whoa, that is more realism than I've ever heard of. Like God is there even if you don't believe in him. And so if you're a theist, if you're a Christian, you should believe that because God exists, everything is meaningful. Which would mean for whoever you're talking to, you can make your priority that they find meaning. And only secondarily, we can say, well, maybe God's behind that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think we assume the priority of the proposition or the presupposition too much, where somebody can be relating to God before they've, formulated that proposition or come to that belief.
This is something that I sent you in preparation for this conversation. I'm just going to read the tail end, and it's someone giving a lecture on T.S. Eliot, and he's talking about philosophy and the way that they handle ideas and what he thinks is the problem that philosophers run into, and maybe why. So he says, an idea is not a thing, and our difficulties arise from trying to treat it as a thing. Eliot says, ideas are comprised by sentences. Philosophy is a genre of prose composition, like a short story. However, in practice, philosophers treat ideas as the building blocks of their systems, and as a consequence, philosophers are less essayists and more engineers. Eliot depicted philosophers as drone bees who labor oblivious to one another unless provoked by insects carrying obnoxiously different theories. He means the quest for scientific certainty can lead to obliviousness, and it can lead to collision. Either the bees ignore each other or they collide with one another. Cooperation, however, is not possible. Cooperation will not be possible. The belief in objective truth has the effect of dividing believers. If the truth is one, if it is unitary, if it is exclusive, there is no room for compromise. There's no room for comparison. There's no room for mutual admiration. There is room for obliviousness, or there is room for conflict. My thoughts on that are, when we reduce God to the propositional, and we ignore the title of Francis Schaeffer's book, that God is, we make that an irrelevant factor, then we reduce our claims to scientific certainty. I was claiming that Kokel is suffering from the same propositional materialism as Alex O'Connor is, and yet he's making metaphysical claims that O'Connor is, he's making the antithetical claims, and yet they're in the same domain. They operate in the same space philosophically. So when you reduce God to an idea and suggest that he is a proposition rather than a reality, then you suffer all of these conflicts with other people that are doing the same thing with their God. And I think that's so interesting. You are a philosophy PhD student. Please respond.
Well, I kind of want to respond with a quotation of my own. I was saving this at the ready from Conversations with Wittgenstein. He's talking to this friend who he's dissuading from becoming an Anglican priest. And Wittgenstein says at one point, talking about Bertrand Russell, the new atheist of the day, Russell and the Parsons between them have done infinite harm. the guy responds, I was puzzled by his coupling Russell and the Parsons in the one condemnation. Wittgenstein goes on to say stuff like, I would be afraid you would try to give some sort of philosophical justification for beliefs, as if some sort of proof was needed if you became a priest. He says later, the symbolisms of Catholicism are wonderful beyond words, but any attempt to make it into a philosophical system is offensive. And there's a great commonality there, but especially that idea that Russell and the Parsons between them have done infinite harm. We could update that and say Dawkins and the apologists have done infinite harm.
Yeah.
Both in this emphasis on propositions to the exclusion of everything else. There's sort of harm to the human spirit that is done in that. And, we look at the results. The greatest period of decline in Christian belief is the 90s, 00s, and teens, which is the period in which the kind of apologetics we're talking about flourished, along with new atheism. And, it's only now that we're seeing a turn in that tide of the sea of faith. So, yeah, I would hope that our listeners, just give that kind of idea some thought.
Thanks, Joel. I really appreciate your time. Thanks for weathering the internet difficulties. And I highly recommend your video and your Substack. Can you plug that?
Yeah, joelcarini.substack.com. It's The Natural Theologian. And I'm doing a bit of YouTube now, too. So check that out.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys. Have a good one.
Thank you, Ian.